These are some of the signs that you're an easily offended movie fan. Alright, first up we have going out of your way to get outraged by anything that you perceive to be quote-unquote woke in pretty much every single movie you watch. Some examples of this archetype include this dude Ben Shapiro burning a Barbie doll because he was outraged by the Barbie movie. Another example would be this YouTube channel Nerdrotic, who makes classic hit videos such as Woke Hollywood is failing, Top 5 Woke Hollywood disasters, Hollywood is fleeing woke Hollywood in droves, or one of the funnier ones I've seen, Gladiator 2 turned its back on masculinity. All because at the beginning of the movie, there was a woman who just happened to be a warrior and she got like 5 minutes of screen time. Yeah, this definitely goes into the way too easily offended tier. I understand that the examples I just listed are most likely doing it for the views and for the money, because being an online crybaby is a very lucrative business nowadays, but I'm just talking about this mentality in general. And yes, there are a lot of these movies that are just blatantly pandering and they're engaging in some sort of empty tokenism just for the sake of it. But if it's to the point where you're getting outraged and complaining every single time a woman or a non-white person is cast as a superhero, at that point you're just kind of being a little bit of a bitch. You're kind of soft. Alright, next up we have going out of your way to get outraged by anything that you perceive to be quote-unquote problematic in pretty much every single movie you watch. And to be clear, I am not talking about people who have valid, genuine criticisms. No, I'm talking about the types of people where you couldn't watch a 2000s era comedy with them without it turning into a lecture. This also goes into the way too easily offended tier, and the thing is, these two groups of people, they are mortal enemies against each other, but they're also kind of the same person. They have the same general personality type of being very tribalistic and very easily offended. They just happen to have different ideologies. They're two sides of the same coin. And next up, we have people who give fair and reasonable criticisms about the social commentary, themes, and messaging in a movie. This one is pretty obvious. It goes into the completely valid tier, and I just wanted to include it to make a clear distinction between these way too easily offended groups versus people who are just giving reasonable criticisms. Movies definitely should be criticized on the basis of their themes, messaging, and social commentary, but the problem is that you have these extremely loud and way too easily offended groups creating so much noise pollution that sometimes it ends up drowning out the legitimate criticisms. And next up, we have getting mad whenever someone criticizes a movie you like. I can kind of understand this mentality. People get very emotionally attached to movies. Movies end up having a pretty big impact on them. But at the same time, you should never be so emotionally invested in a movie that you actually get mad just because someone else disagrees with you about it. It's just a fucking movie. And to be fair, I don't think that movie fans are quite as bad in this regard compared to music fans. They will go berserk on you if you criticize their favorite artist, especially if you're talking about Taylor Swift stans or Drake stans or Kendrick stans. Movie fans are not quite as bad, but they can still be pretty annoying about this. I think it's kind of similar to the way a lot of sports fans are rooting for their favorite team to win the championship. There's a lot of movie fans who are rooting for their favorite movie to win the most critical acclaim and become this beloved classic movie. But I think it's kind of silly because it doesn't matter if other people don't like the same movies as you. As long as you enjoy the movie, that's all that really matters. Every movie is someone's favorite movie. It doesn't have to be this competition where you want your movie to be the most critically acclaimed movie and become this canonized classic. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to put this into the easily offended tier because I don't think it's quite as bad as these groups. It's mostly just people who are very passionate about a movie that had a big impact on them. However, there is a caveat. There are certain people who will actually harass other people just for criticizing their favorite movie. And those people would definitely go into the way too easily offended tier. But generally speaking, I think most people who are getting mad over people criticizing their favorite movie, they're not too bad about it, at least when it comes to movie fans. Music fans are a different story, but movie fans, they're not too bad about it, so I'll put them into the easily offended tier. Okay, next we have getting upset whenever a movie adaptation makes changes from the original source material. And for the most part, this is a fair criticism, especially in cases where the movie is making changes that actually make the story worse, or if they're doing it in a way that disrespects the original source material, that's completely fair to point out and criticize. But you do also have to realize that not everything that's going to work in a book or a comic book or something like that is going to translate directly into movie. Pretty much all of the best movie adaptations, they have to make some changes from the book, otherwise the movie would not have turned out as good as it did. You can't always just make a one-to-one direct adaptation. It just doesn't work all the time. And some book purists are maybe a little bit too extreme with their devotion to the source material. At a certain point, you have to give some leeway to the filmmakers because they are making a movie. It has to work as a movie. So you're going to have to make some changes from the source material to make that happen. And not only that, there are some really great movie adaptations that kind of shit on the original source material, but they're still great movies. The Shining being a great example of that. So I'm going to put this into the mostly valid tier because it is a fair criticism, but I can't quite put it into completely valid because there is a point where it starts just being a little bit unreasonable. And next we have not separating the art from the artist. I think this is mostly just dependent on personal preference. Everyone has their own threshold when it comes to this. I think generally speaking, the better the art, the more leeway you are willing to give when it comes to separating the art from the artist. Like if you just have a mediocre movie and the director was a terrible person, yeah, you might just skip it. But if it was the case where the movie is an absolute masterpiece and the director did something questionable, most people would be willing to separate the art from the artist in that case. I'm going to put this into the mostly valid tier. Personally, I am very much a separate the art from the artist person, but I can understand why other people are not willing to do that. That's fair in my opinion. Although I'm not going to put it into completely valid because with every movie, there are so many people working on the movie. Pretty much every movie is bound to have at least one bad person working on the set. Getting upset when someone spoils a movie you haven't seen. I think this is completely valid. You hear those stories of a super anticipated movie where people are lining up around the block to see a movie in theaters, and then you have jackasses who just saw the previous screening coming out and screaming out spoilers to the entire people waiting in line. Yeah, like what kind of fucked up person does that? That's just mean. And this is especially valid when it's a movie that's still in theaters and people are spending good money to go watch this in theaters and you're just making the movie watching experience worse for them. Yeah, that's kind of fucked up. Getting upset when a movie trailer is misleading. Yeah, this is another fair criticism. If you're spending good money to watch a movie in theaters and the studio was false advertising the movie, you do have every right to be upset about that. However, at the same time, in today's day and age, it is incredibly easy to simply go on the internet, look up some reviews just to make sure that the movie is what you're expecting it to be. This would be like buying a product on Amazon because you saw a commercial for it on TV, but you didn't bother to look up any of the product reviews. I mean, yeah, you should still hold the company accountable for false advertising, but at the same time, you could have very easily simply looked up some reviews to make sure you weren't wasting your money. And again, I do think it is very fair to criticize the studios for doing this, but at the same time, in most cases, the filmmakers who made the movie don't have that much control over how the movie is advertised. So it does kind of suck when filmmakers are getting criticized for something that they didn't really have any control over, and it was just the studio marketing department doing it. But I'm still going to put this into the mostly valid tier. Getting upset when a movie covers disturbing or controversial subject matter. In a lot of cases, this really is just people being way too easily offended. Movies absolutely should be able to cover disturbing and controversial subject matter, and this is especially annoying when you have people thinking that just because a movie has something controversial in it or disturbing, that means that the movie is endorsing that. No, it's simply making a movie about that. That doesn't mean that it's endorsing it. But I will say there are cases where this is just a valid criticism. If the movie is handling this subject matter in a gratuitous or distasteful way, or in a way that just feels like they're doing it for shock value just for the sake of it. There are a lot of cases where this is a valid criticism. So I'm going to put this into the sometimes valid tier. It really can go either way. Sometimes it's people just being way too easily offended, but a lot of times it is a valid and fair criticism. So it goes into the sometimes valid tier. Getting upset when your favorite movie doesn't get enough award recognition. Personally, I don't care at all about the Academy Awards or any of these award shows, but at the same time, they do kind of matter in the sense that they give exposure to certain movies, especially if you have a movie that might be smaller budget or an international movie. If it gets nominated for a bunch of awards, especially Best Picture, that usually means that there's going to be millions of people who otherwise never would have watched that movie, but they're now going to be interested in watching it. So purely from an exposure perspective, awards kind of do matter. But at the same time, you also do have a lot of cases where it really is just people who are mad that their favorite movie is not winning all the awards, even though the movie that is, a lot of times is just as deserving of getting that exposure. So I'm going to put this into the sometimes valid tier. Sometimes it is a legitimate thing to bring up, but also a lot of times it is people just getting way too easily offended because their favorite movie is not winning some dumb award show. Accusing people of being paid shills whenever they like a movie that you don't like. Okay, here's the thing. Has this happened before? Absolutely. There's astroturfing campaigns, and I'm sure there's been many cases where critics were given some sort of compensation or something to give a favorable review of a movie. I'm sure it's happened before, but it does not happen nearly as often as some of these people make it seem. Like, there's people out there who are accusing people of being shills pretty much for every single movie that comes out, and they have no evidence to back it up. At a certain point, it starts getting a little bit ridiculous. So I got to put this into the easily offended tier. I'm not going to put this into the way too easily offended tier because, yeah, most likely this actually has happened before, and I can understand people being frustrated about spending their money on something because some critics told them it was worth spending their money on, and then they ended up feeling like they wasted their money. I can get the frustration behind it, but it really is kind of ridiculous to think that this is happening all the time, and this is every single movie. All of these critics are just paid shills. You have no evidence to back it up. Most critics are just giving their honest opinion on a movie, and just because they like a movie that you didn't like doesn't mean that they're paid shills. No, they just have a different opinion than you. Getting annoyed when people are being loud in theaters or on their phone during the entire movie. Yeah, that's completely valid. People are being loud during movies or just being inconsiderate. If you're not an easily offended movie fan and you want some recommendations, check out this classic cinema tier list.